September 25, 1967. While record stores across America still stock copies of the Doors' debut album, still sitting pretty in the Billboard Top 10 after nearly a year, Elektra Records ships out their second release, Strange Days. The title is prophetic. Inside Sunset Sound Recorders in Hollywood, the band has spent 6 months recording in near-total darkness. Candles flicker in corners, incense smoke curls through 8-track tape machines. Jim Morrison lies on the floor, 8 months into touring that's already turning him into something he never wanted to be. A rock star sex symbol, when all he wanted was to be taken seriously as a poet. The album they've made is stranger, darker, more experimental than anything they attempted on their debut. They've pushed technology to its limits, used one of rock's first Moog synthesizers, recorded piano parts backwards, and created soundscapes by dropping Coca-Cola bottles into trash cans while people screamed into microphones. Producer Paul Rothchild is convinced they've created something bigger than Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Engineer Bruce Botnick thinks they've captured lightning twice. The band knows they've made their purest artistic statement. But the week after its release, while Strange Days peaks at number 3 on the Billboard chart, Jim Morrison will walk onto the Ed Sullivan Show stage and commit an act of defiance that will get them banned for life. And the album that everyone involved believed would eclipse the Beatles will become known as their worst-selling record with Morrison alive. This is the story of how the Doors made their most ambitious album at the exact moment fame began destroying them. How they used the studio as an instrument to create sounds no one had heard before. And how an album dismissed as a commercial disappointment would eventually be recognized as one of the great artifacts of the rock movement. Welcome to the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. This is Strange Days. January 1967. The Doors' self-titled debut album drops like a bomb on American rock music. Within months, Light My Fire becomes the #1 song in the country. Jim Morrison, Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore go from playing the Whiskey A Go-Go for beer money to appearing on every major television show in America. But here's the secret nobody knows. Strange Days already exists. Not on tape, not yet, but in notebooks, in Morrison's poetry journals, in the band's pre-fame rehearsals at the London Fog Club on Sunset Boulevard. Moonlight Drive was the second song the Doors ever wrote. Morrison conceived it before he even reconnected with Manzarek on Venice Beach in the summer of 1965. They'd already demoed it at Trans World Pacific Studios in 1965, before Krieger even joined the band. They tried recording it twice for the debut album. Both times, something felt wrong. They shelved it, knowing they'd come back to it when they were ready. My Eyes Have Seen You came from that same era, the hungry pre-fame days when Morrison was still a film school dropout living on rooftops, writing poetry at 3 a.m., dropping acid and wandering through Laurel Canyon having visions about perception and reality. This is crucial to understanding Strange Days. It wasn't created under pressure to follow up a hit. It was born from the same artistic wellspring as their debut. The Doors entered 1967 with enough material for 3 albums. They hadn't run out of ideas. They'd simply saved the weirder, darker, more experimental songs for later. But then, Light My Fire happened. Suddenly, the Doors weren't just a promising band on Elektra Records. They were the biggest rock act in America. The debut album was on its way to selling 4 million copies. Morrison's face was on every magazine cover. Teenage girls screamed at concerts. The record label started talking about their sound and their brand. And that's when Strange Days became something different. Not just an album. A test. Could the Doors maintain their artistic integrity while everyone around them was trying to turn them into a hit machine? Could they make something even more experimental when the industry wanted Light My Fire Part 2? The answer would be decided in a former auto repair garage on Sunset Boulevard, where the studio floor still sloped toward a drain that once caught motor oil, and where a band would spend 6 months recording in darkness, because that's when Morrison's voice sounded most honest. January 1967. The Doors' self-titled debut album drops like a bomb on American rock music. Within months, Light My Fire becomes the #1 song in the country. Jim Morrison, Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore go from playing the Whiskey A Go-Go for beer money to appearing on every major television show in America. But here's the secret nobody knows. Strange Days already exists. Not on tape, not yet, but in notebooks, in Morrison's poetry journals, in the band's pre-fame rehearsals at the London Fog Club on Sunset Boulevard. Moonlight Drive was the second song the Doors ever wrote. Morrison conceived it before he even reconnected with Manzarek on Venice Beach in the summer of 1965. They'd already demoed it at Trans World Pacific Studios in 1965, before Krieger even joined the band. They tried recording it twice for the debut album. Both times, something felt wrong. They shelved it, knowing they'd come back to it when they were ready. My Eyes Have Seen You came from that same era, the hungry pre-fame days when Morrison was still a film school dropout living on rooftops, writing poetry at 3 a.m., dropping acid and wandering through Laurel Canyon having visions about perception and reality. This is crucial to understanding Strange Days. It wasn't created under pressure to follow up a hit. It was born from the same artistic wellspring as their debut. The Doors entered 1967 with enough material for 3 albums. They hadn't run out of ideas. They'd simply saved the weirder, darker, more experimental songs for later. But then, Light My Fire happened. Suddenly, the Doors weren't just a promising band on Elektra Records. They were the biggest rock act in America. The debut album was on its way to selling 4 million copies. Morrison's face was on every magazine cover. Teenage girls screamed at concerts. The record label started talking about their sound and their brand. And that's when Strange Days became something different. Not just an album. A test. Could the Doors maintain their artistic integrity while everyone around them was trying to turn them into a hit machine? Could they make something even more experimental when the industry wanted Light My Fire Part 2? The answer would be decided in a former auto repair garage on Sunset Boulevard, where the studio floor still sloped toward a drain that once caught motor oil, and where a band would spend 6 months recording in darkness, because that's when Morrison's voice sounded most honest. January 1967. The Doors' self-titled debut album drops like a bomb on American rock music. Within months, Light My Fire becomes the #1 song in the country. Jim Morrison, Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore go from playing the Whiskey A Go-Go for beer money to appearing on every major television show in America. But here's the secret nobody knows. Strange Days already exists. Not on tape, not yet, but in notebooks, in Morrison's poetry journals, in the band's pre-fame rehearsals at the London Fog Club on Sunset Boulevard. Moonlight Drive was the second song the Doors ever wrote. Morrison conceived it before he even reconnected with Manzarek on Venice Beach in the summer of 1965. They'd already demoed it at Trans World Pacific Studios in 1965, before Krieger even joined the band. They tried recording it twice for the debut album. Both times, something felt wrong. They shelved it, knowing they'd come back to it when they were ready. My Eyes Have Seen You came from that same era, the hungry pre-fame days when Morrison was still a film school dropout living on rooftops, writing poetry at 3 a.m., dropping acid and wandering through Laurel Canyon having visions about perception and reality. This is crucial to understanding Strange Days. It wasn't created under pressure to follow up a hit. It was born from the same artistic wellspring as their debut. The Doors entered 1967 with enough material for 3 albums. They hadn't run out of ideas. They'd simply saved the weirder, darker, more experimental songs for later. But then, Light My Fire happened. Suddenly, the Doors weren't just a promising band on Elektra Records. They were the biggest rock act in America. The debut album was on its way to selling 4 million copies. Morrison's face was on every magazine cover. Teenage girls screamed at concerts. The record label started talking about their sound and their brand. And that's when Strange Days became something different. Not just an album. A test. Could the Doors maintain their artistic integrity while everyone around them was trying to turn them into a hit machine? Could they make something even more experimental when the industry wanted Light My Fire Part 2? The answer would be decided in a former auto repair garage on Sunset Boulevard, where the studio floor still sloped toward a drain that once caught motor oil, and where a band would spend 6 months recording in darkness, because that's when Morrison's voice sounded most honest. Spring 1967. While Light My Fire climbs the charts, engineer Bruce Botnick gets his hands on something that will change everything. A monoacetate of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Before it's released to the public, he plays it for the Doors and producer Paul Rothchild. The room goes silent. Then Ray Manzarek says what everyone's thinking. Oh my God! It's not that they want to copy the Beatles. It's that Sgt. Pepper proves something crucial. The studio itself can be an instrument. You don't have to just capture a performance. You can build soundscapes, layer textures, manipulate reality itself. We were there anyway, Botnick would later say. But Pepper convinced us that we could go forward. The Doors have one massive advantage the Beatles didn't have on their first album, 8-track recording. The debut was recorded on 4-track, which essentially captured how they sounded live. But 8 tracks? That means 4 tracks for the basic performance, 4 tracks for experimentation, overdubs, backwards instruments, electronic manipulation. The studio as an alchemical laboratory. Rothchild's vision for Strange Days is ambitious. Create music that works as theater, as ritual drama in 5 acts, like Greek tragedy. He wants each song to have a narrative arc, tension, climax, catharsis. He wants the album to flow as one complete experience, not just a collection of singles. Morrison has his own vision. He wants Strange Days to explore alienation, what it feels like to be a stranger in your own life, to feel out of sync with reality itself. The title isn't just provocative, it's a diagnosis. Morrison can already feel fame changing him, making him into a character people project their fantasies onto. Strange Days becomes his way of articulating that disconnect. For Krieger, it's about pushing his guitar work beyond blues and rock into uncharted territory. Bottleneck slide guitar that sounds eerie and off-kilter. Double-tracked solos that twist through the songs like fever dreams. Manzarek wants to explore the organ in ways he couldn't on the debut. Backwards piano parts, harpsichord, marimba. He wants each song to have its own sonic signature. And Densmore, the drummer who'd studied with Miles Davis's former percussionist. He wants to bring jazz sensibilities to rock. Unusual time signatures, rhythmic complexity that doesn't announce itself but creates subtle unease. They all agree on one thing: no compromises. They're not making Strange Days to please radio programmers or satisfy Elektra's accountants. They're making it because they have something to say about the state of America in 1967. A country coming apart at the seams. A generation trying to find meaning through drugs and music and revolution. A mainstream culture that looks at anything different and calls it dangerous. The album will be their statement. Their refusal to play it safe. Their middle finger to anyone who wants them to repeat themselves. We were confident it was going to be bigger than anything the Beatles had done, Rothchild later admitted. But there was no single. The record died on us. But that's getting ahead of the story. First, they had to make it. Sunset Sound Recorders, Studio One. A rectangular room with an 8-foot ceiling and a floor that slopes down toward the control room. A remnant of the building's past life as an auto repair garage, where the incline helped motor oil drain away. The walls, ceiling, and floor are all non-parallel, which accidentally creates perfect acoustic control. It's weird. It's imperfect. It's exactly right for what the Doors are trying to do. Recording begins in February 1967, during breaks from touring. The Doors are now playing sold-out shows, but they schedule the sessions for late night, sometimes midnight to dawn, because that's when Morrison's voice has the texture they need, when his demons are most honest. Rothchild and Botnick set up the room in darkness. Not metaphorical darkness, actual darkness. A few candles. The glow of cigarettes and joints. The band can barely see each other. It forces them to listen more carefully, to feel the music rather than perform it. The first track they record is People Are Strange. It has a backstory that reveals everything about where Morrison's head is at. One morning, Krieger and Densmore, roommates on Lookout Mountain Drive in Laurel Canyon, get a visit from Morrison. He's deeply depressed, pacing, talking about how fucked up everything is. How fame is turning him into something he isn't. Krieger suggests they walk to the top of Laurel Canyon to watch the sunset. Morrison reluctantly agrees. They climb to Appian Way, looking down on Los Angeles as the sun sets, light reflecting off clouds. And something shifts in Morrison. He gets that look, the one where he's no longer present. where he's following some internal vision. He says, "Now I know why I felt like that. It's because if you're strange, people are strange." By the time they walk back down the hill, Morrison has written the entire song. Krieger hears the melody, knows immediately it's a hit. They record it with a European cabaret quality, unusual for rock, but perfect for the lyrical alienation Morrison is articulating. Krieger records the guitar solo in one take. Done. Moving on. Love Me Two Times comes next. Krieger's bluesy number about a soldier spending his last day with his girlfriend before shipping out to war. Maybe about lust and loss. Maybe about multiple orgasms. Manzarek isn't sure which. Neither is anyone else. That ambiguity is the point. Then they start getting weird. Strange Days, the title track, becomes an experiment in emerging technology. Paul Beaver arrives with a Moog synthesizer, one of the first in existence. The thing is massive, temperamental, sounds like nothing anyone has heard before. It's essentially a giant electronic oscillator that can filter and modulate sound in ways that seem alien. Botnick later describes the process. "We created an envelope where we could feed Jim's track into the Moog so that he could play any note on the keyboard and it would process his voice. I then added a little delay and fed the whole thing into an infinite tape repeat. That was hand-played. The result is haunting. Morrison's voice turned into an electronic ghost, hovering over the track like a transmission from another dimension. It's one of the earliest uses of a Moog synthesizer in rock music, months before the Beatles would use one on Abbey Road. Unhappy Girl pushes the experimentation further. Manzarek writes out the chord changes, then starts at the bottom right-hand corner of the page and plays everything backwards, right to left, bottom to top. The resulting keyboard part sounds wrong in a way that's impossible to define. Your brain knows something is reversed, but can't quite pinpoint what. It creates perfect unease for a song about emotional disconnection. Horse Latitudes is where things get truly experimental. Morrison has carried this poem since high school, written after seeing a paperback book cover depicting horses being thrown off ships. Horse latitudes are regions of the ocean where ships would get becalmed for days. Temperatures would soar. To conserve food and water, sailors would throw horses overboard. The imagery haunted Morrison for years. For the recording, Rothchild tells the band, "Anything goes." Botnick takes white noise from a tape recorder and varies the speed by hand-winding it, creating a sound like wind. The band plays pianos, harpsichords, timpani, not musically but percussively, creating chaos. People scream into microphones. Someone drops Coca-Cola bottles into garbage cans. Coconut shells are beaten against tile floors. Morrison reads his poem in one take, his voice raw, pained, channeling the death throes of drowning animals. It's disturbing. It's brilliant. It's exactly 95 seconds of everything critics will hate about The Doors. But Manzarek defends it years later. Ray Manzarek said he never believed Morrison wrote it in high school. The words were too mature. But Morrison insisted it was one of the first poems he ever committed to paper. The album's epic closer, When the Music's Over, becomes Krieger's showcase. Inspired by Herbie Hancock's Watermelon Man, the 11-minute track features a double-tracked guitar solo that Krieger considers his best work with The Doors. It's structured like The End from the debut. Long, episodic, building to catharsis. Some critics will call it derivative. Krieger's response, "Something works, so you do it again. How can you possibly top The End? What's left once you've fucked your mother and killed your father?" The sessions stretch from February through August, 6 months of recording during tour breaks. The band is exhausted. Morrison is drinking more, but the work is focused, deliberate. Rothchild is producing with a perfectionist's ear. Botnick is capturing everything with technical precision. By late August, they have 10 tracks. No obvious single. Nothing with the immediate hook of Light My Fire. But something deeper, weirder, more artistically coherent. Rothchild is convinced they've created a masterpiece. "We all thought it was the best album," he'll later say. Significantly, it was also the one with the weakest sales. Summer of 1967. While the Doors are perfecting Strange Days in the studio, Jim Morrison is falling apart in public. The debut album has been a double-edged sword. Yes, it made them famous. Yes, they're playing sold-out shows. But fame has turned Morrison into exactly what he feared. A sex symbol, a teen idol, a leather-clad rebel that teenage girls scream for, and teenage boys want to be. Morrison wanted to be taken seriously as a poet, as an intellectual exploring consciousness and perception. Instead, he's being photographed shirtless for 16 magazine. TV shows want him to smile more. Fans mob him on the street. The Ed Sullivan Show will ask him to censor his lyrics. The weight of it is crushing him. His drinking escalates. Not social drinking, but blackout drinking. The kind where he disappears for days and no one knows where he's been. Krieger and Densmore find him depressed on their couch at dawn, talking about suicide. The walk up Laurel Canyon that births People Are Strange isn't romantic. It's an intervention. The pressure to follow up a massive hit is immense. Elektra Records has announced a record-breaking advance order of 500,000 copies of Strange Days. The label expects another Light My Fire, another crossover hit that will dominate AM radio. They don't understand what the Doors are actually making. A dark, experimental art album with Moog synthesizers and backwards pianos and poems about drowning horses. Rothchild tries to shield the band from label pressure, but he can't protect them from themselves. Morrison is already showing the unpredictability that will eventually destroy him. Brilliant one moment, incoherent the next. Focused in the studio at midnight, disappeared by morning. The creative process itself creates tension. Working in total darkness for months is psychologically intense. Recording Morrison's voice for Hoarse Latitudes while the band creates chaos around him, people screaming, instruments being beaten, feels less like making music and more like channeling something dangerous. And then there's the elephant in the room. Moonlight Drive. They've tried recording it 3 times now. Twice for the debut, once early in the Strange Days sessions. Each version feels wrong. The song is haunted. Morrison conceived it before the Doors were even a band, before he knew if this music thing would work. It's supposed to be on this album. It has to be. But they can't seem to capture whatever magic the song needs. Finally, they try again. Krieger uses bottleneck slide guitar, creating an eerie off-kilter sound. They make the rhythm slightly offbeat, intentionally unsettling. And suddenly, it clicks. The song that's been haunting them for 2 years finally reveals itself. But even creative breakthroughs feel bittersweet. The band knows Strange Days is their most cohesive artistic statement. They also know it's not going to be as commercially successful as the debut. There's no Light My Fire here. The singles, People Are Strange and Love Me 2 Times, are good, but they're not anthems. They're too weird, too European sounding, too ambiguous. Rothchild keeps insisting the album will be huge. Bigger than anything the Beatles have done, he tells them. But there's a note of desperation in his voice. He believes it, needs to believe it. But he also knows the music industry doesn't reward artistic ambition. It rewards catchy hooks and radio-friendly running times. By September, when Strange Days is complete, Morrison is barely holding it together. The Ed Sullivan Show appearance is scheduled for September 17th, just 8 days before the album releases. It should be a triumphant moment. Instead, it will become a disaster that perfectly encapsulates everything wrong with fame, censorship, and the collision between art and commerce. September 17, 1967, The Ed Sullivan Show. Studio 50 in New York City. The Doors arrive for rehearsals that afternoon. Everything goes smoothly. Ed Sullivan himself comes to their dressing room 15 minutes before airtime and tells them, "You boys look great, but you ought to smile a little more." Then a producer arrives with a request. Change one word in Light My Fire. The line, "Girl, we couldn't get much higher," needs to become, "Girl, we couldn't get much better." The word higher is too suggestive, might be interpreted as drug reference. This is a family show. Band members give conflicting accounts about what happens next. Did they agree to the change? Did they say yes to the producer's face while planning to ignore it? Or did they refuse outright? What's certain is this. When the Doors perform Light My Fire live on national television, Jim Morrison sings the original lyric, "Girl, we couldn't get much higher." No hesitation, no apology. The moment the show ends, Ed Sullivan is furious. "You will never do this show again," he tells them. Morrison's response becomes legendary. "Hey, that's okay. We just did the Ed Sullivan Show." Krieger later reflects, "We thought they were joking. Who were they kidding? Wanting us to change the lyrics on the #1 song in America? We decided to just do the song as is, and maybe they would forget all about it. What could they do? After all, it was live television. What they could do was ban the Doors for life." The 6 additional appearances Sullivan had planned? Cancelled. The publicity boost that appearance was supposed to give Strange Days, tainted by controversy instead of amplifying the music. 8 days later, on September 25, 1967, Strange Days hits record stores. Elektra has shipped 500,000 advance copies, a vote of confidence in the album's commercial potential. The early reviews are rapturous. Rolling Stone writes, "Strange Days has all the power and energy of the first LP, but is more subtle, more intricate, and much more effective." They praise the album's theatrical structure, arguing that, like Greek drama, you know when the music's over because there is catharsis. Gene Youngblood of LA. Free Press is even more enthusiastic. The Doors' music is more surreal than psychedelic. It is more anguished than acid. But commercially, something strange happens. Strange Days enters the Billboard chart and quickly climbs to number 3. A success by any measure. Except the Doors' debut album is still sitting in the top 10. It's been there for over 10 months, shows no signs of leaving, has already spent 2 weeks at number 1. The 2 albums are cannibalizing each other. Fans who already own the debut are curious about Strange Days, but not urgently so. New fans are still discovering the Doors, but they're buying the debut first. That's where Light My Fire lives after all. People Are Strange is released as the lead single. It peaks at number 12. Respectable, but not the top 5 hit Elektra wanted. Love Me 2 Times follows, reaching number 25. Again, solid but not spectacular. In the UK, where the debut had been a critical success, Strange Days doesn't chart at all. British audiences are still trying to figure out if the Doors are a novelty act or the real thing. Without a clear hit single, Strange Days comes and goes without making an impact. The album stays on the charts for 63 weeks, longer than many #1 albums, but it never feels like a phenomenon the way the debut did. Rothchild's prediction, bigger than Sgt. Pepper, proves heartbreakingly wrong. Music journalist Stephen Davis later identifies Strange Days as the Doors' worst-selling album during Morrison's lifetime. It's commercially overshadowed by both the debut and the next album, Waiting for the Sun, which will produce the #1 hit, Hello, I Love You. But something else is happening beneath the surface. The critics who really listen, who sit with the album, who understand what the Doors are attempting, start recognizing Strange Days as something special. Not a hit machine, an artistic statement. A document of what rock music could be when ambition overrode commerce. Robert Christgau calls it muscular but misshapen, but concedes that the Doors have emerged from nowhere to reign as America's heaviest group. The band's own assessment is conflicted. They know they've made something artistically superior to the debut. Manzarek later says Strange Days is when we began to experiment with the studio itself as an instrument. Morrison, in a 1970 interview, reflects, "I'm really proud of our second record. It tells a story. It's a whole effort. Someday it will get the recognition it deserves." But in the fall of 1967, as Strange Days underperforms expectations, one thing becomes clear. Artistic ambition doesn't guarantee commercial success, and the Doors are about to learn that the music industry has little patience for bands who refuse to repeat their hits. Strange Days didn't change rock music overnight. It didn't spawn 100 copycat albums or redefine what was possible in the studio. Its impact was quieter, deeper, more lasting. First, the technology. The use of a Moog synthesizer on the title track was one of the earliest instances in rock music, predating its more famous appearance on the Beatles' Abbey Road by 2 years. The Doors and Paul Beaver proved that synthesizers weren't just for avant-garde electronic music. They could be integrated into rock, creating textures that were simultaneously futuristic and primal. Bruce Botnick's engineering innovations, feeding Morrison's vocals through the Moog, creating infinite tape delays, manipulating tape speeds by hand, became techniques that studio engineers would study and emulate for decades. The album demonstrated that an 8-track machine in the right hands could be as expressive as any musical instrument. Second, the artistic precedent. Strange Days proved that a band could follow up a massively successful debut with something more experimental and survive. Yes, it sold less. Yes, radio programmers were confused by the lack of obvious singles, but the Doors maintained their credibility. Critics took them seriously as artists, not just hitmakers. This mattered immensely in 1967, when rock was transitioning from teen entertainment to legitimate art form. The Doors, alongside the Beatles, the Beach Boys, and others, were redefining what albums could be, not just collections of singles, but complete artistic statements with thematic coherence. Third, the influence on other artists. Strange Days became a cult favorite among musicians who cared more about experimentation than commercial success. The album's dark, theatrical sound influenced everyone from Iggy Pop and the Stooges to Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds to Nine Inch Nails. The way Strange Days balanced accessibility with avant-garde tendencies created a template. You could write songs people might actually hear on the radio. People Are Strange, Love Me 2 Times, but surround them with material that challenged listeners. Hoarse latitudes, backwards piano parts, 11-minute epics. This approach, commercial enough to get released, weird enough to matter, became a model for alternative and underground rock. Fourth, the songs themselves proved immortal. While Strange Days didn't produce the cultural phenomenon of Light My Fire, its best tracks became concert staples and classic rock standards. People Are Strange found new life in the 1987 film The Lost Boys, where Echo and the Bunnymen covered it with Ray Manzarek producing. The song introduced the Doors to a new generation. When the Music's Over became one of the band's most celebrated live performances, its 11-minute runtime giving Morrison space to improvise, to channel whatever demons were coursing through him on any given night. Bootlegs of different performances revealed how the song evolved, how Morrison used it as a vehicle for poetry and rage. More broadly, Strange Days influenced how rock critics thought about difficult second albums. The phrase, "the best of the batch had already been cherry-picked for the debut," became a cliché precisely because Strange Days seemed to prove it. But over time, critics began reassessing. Maybe Strange Days wasn't weak. Maybe it was just different, more cohesive, more ambitious, less concerned with hits. Music journalist Stephen Davis eventually declared Strange Days the best Doors album and one of the great artifacts of the rock movement, a complete reversal of the initial reception. The album's failure to match the debut's commercial success actually enhanced its reputation among serious music fans. Strange Days became the album for people who wanted to prove they understood the Doors at a deeper level than casual fans. It was the critics' choice, the musicians' favorite. The album that revealed itself slowly rather than announcing itself with obvious hooks. In 2007, Rolling Stone included Strange Days on their list of the 40 essential albums of 1967, ranking it alongside Sgt. Pepper, Are You Experienced, and The Velvet Underground and Nico. In 2012, it appeared at number 409 on Rolling Stone's list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. Perhaps most significantly, Strange Days proved that commercial disappointment doesn't equal artistic failure. The album that producer Paul Rothchild thought would be bigger than anything the Beatles had done became something more valuable. A time capsule of ambition, a document of what happens when artists refuse to compromise. and a reminder that the best art isn't always the most popular. Strange Days released into a world that was, as the title suggested, becoming increasingly strange. 1967 was the summer of love, but also the summer America's divisions became impossible to ignore. The Vietnam War escalated. Riots erupted in Detroit and Newark. The counterculture and mainstream culture faced off with increasing hostility. The Doors found themselves at the center of multiple controversies, some of their own making, others thrust upon them. The Ed Sullivan Show ban became the most visible controversy. Morrison's refusal to censor Higher from Light My Fire was celebrated by counterculture fans as an act of artistic integrity and condemned by conservative critics as juvenile rebellion. The ban reinforced the Doors' outlaw image, but it also cost them mainstream exposure precisely when Strange Days needed promotional support. Then there was the album cover itself, another controversy, though less noticed at the time. For the first time, a Doors album didn't feature the band's image prominently. Instead, photographer Joel Brodsky shot street performers in Manhattan's Sniffin' Court. The concept was artistic, cinematic, mysterious. The execution was chaotic. Actual street performers couldn't be found for all the roles, so Brodsky's assistant posed as a juggler. A random cab driver was paid $5 to pretend to play trumpet. Twin dwarfs were hired, one for the front cover, one for the back, which was actually the other half of the same photograph. A tiny poster in the background showed the band, but it was barely visible. The result was striking but confusing. Record stores had to put stickers on the cover identifying the artist and album title because customers couldn't tell who it was. Some interpreted the cover as Morrison refusing to be commodified as a sex symbol. Others saw it as artistic pretension. More troubling was Morrison's rapidly deteriorating behavior. The drinking that had been heavy during Strange Day sessions became blackout drinking during the tour. Concerts became unpredictable. Sometimes Morrison was brilliant. Sometimes he was so drunk he couldn't remember lyrics. Sometimes he didn't show up at all. The band started covering for him, then resenting him, then fearing for him. Krieger, Manzarek, and Densmore were professional musicians who took their craft seriously. Morrison was becoming something else, a performance artist using his own destruction as material. There were also whispers, never fully substantiated but persistent, about the extent of Morrison's drug use. LSD had been part of the Doors' creative process from the beginning. Morrison called acid the foundation on which to build. But by late 1967, the experimentation was becoming something darker. Friends noticed Morrison seemed to be looking for oblivion rather than enlightenment. The controversy over Horse Latitudes was more critical than popular. Music critics couldn't agree if it was brilliant experimental poetry or pretentious nonsense. Some called it the album's most daring moment. Others labeled it unlistenable. Rolling Stone would later include it on a list of worst songs by great bands, calling it 95 endless seconds. And there was the ongoing debate about whether the Doors were even a good band. Critics like Robert Christgau, who called Strange Days muscular but misshapen, questioned whether Morrison's poetry and persona were masking limited musical chops. Others countered that the Doors' unique sound, no bass guitar, Manzarek's organ holding down the low end, was precisely what made them innovative. But the deepest controversy was largely invisible in 1967. The tension between art and commerce, between what the Doors wanted to create and what their label and fans wanted to receive. Strange Days was the album where this tension first became undeniable. Elektra Records wanted another Light My Fire. The Doors made Horse Latitudes. Fans wanted more songs they could sing along to. The Doors made 11-minute epics with backwards piano parts. Radio programmers wanted 3-minute hits. The Doors gave them cryptic experiments with Moog synthesizers. The controversy wasn't scandalous or salacious. It was fundamental. Could a band maintain artistic integrity in an industry built on commercial success? Strange Days asked that question. The answer, commercial disappointment, critical respect, enduring legacy, took decades to fully emerge. Pull up Strange Days today, on vinyl, streaming, whatever, And listen to the title track. That eerie, processed vocal, hovering like a ghost over the music. That's not just a period piece. That's the sound of rock music growing up, learning it could be art without apologizing. Strange Days didn't save rock and roll. It didn't need to. What it did was prove something quieter but just as important. Commercial success and artistic achievement don't always arrive at the same time. Sometimes the best work takes years to be recognized. The album eventually earned platinum certification. Over 1 million copies sold. But it took decades. The journey from worst-selling album in Morrison's lifetime to one of the great artifacts of the rock movement is the story of how reputations evolve when people actually listen. Music critics eventually came around. The 2007 40th anniversary edition prompted reassessments. Sal Cinquemani of Slant magazine argued that, while The Doors had more frequent, obvious peaks, the quirky Strange Days is a more ambitious, unified work. There are fewer filler tracks, and each song carries as much weight as the one before and after it. Author Mike McGonigal wrote in his book on The Doors, Strange Days offers the greatest evidence of what The Doors might have achieved had they not been so intent on following their debut album's commercial success. The album's influence rippled through generations. When artists like Trent Reznor, Nick Cave, and Brandon Flowers cite The Doors as influences, they're not talking about Light My Fire. They're talking about the dark theatricality of Strange Days, the willingness to make listeners uncomfortable, to explore the shadows. The Lost Boys soundtrack in 1987 brought People Are Strange to Generation X, with Echo and the Bunnymen's cover climbing to number 29 on the Billboard Hot 100. Suddenly, kids who weren't born when Morrison died were discovering The Doors through their second album. The song became a gateway. Here, People Are Strange, get curious, discover Strange Days, fall down the rabbit hole. In the digital age, Strange Days found new audiences again. Streaming removed the barrier of commitment. You didn't have to buy the album to hear it. Playlists curated by algorithms introduced Moonlight Drive and When the Music's Over to listeners who might have only known Light My Fire or Riders on the Storm. Music forums and Reddit threads debated whether Strange Days was actually The Doors' best album. Not their most popular, but their most cohesive artistic statement. The consensus among serious fans shifted. The debut had the hits, but Strange Days had the vision. The album's production techniques became studied material in audio engineering programs. Bruce Botnick's innovations, the Moog processing, the tape manipulation, the use of darkness and candlelight to create a specific recording atmosphere, demonstrated that engineering was as much art as science. Bands learning to work in studios, especially bands with limited budgets who needed to maximize creativity over expensive equipment, studied how The Doors used 8 tracks to create layered soundscapes. The backwards piano on Unhappy Girl, the found sound percussion on Horse Latitudes, the double-tracked guitars on When the Music's Over. These became teaching moments about what was possible when imagination mattered more than technology. Perhaps most significantly, Strange Days became emblematic of the cult classic phenomenon. An album that underperforms commercially but achieves critical and fan devotion over time. This pattern, failure at release, redemption through reassessment, would repeat throughout rock history. But Strange Days was one of the first prominent examples. The 50th anniversary in 2017 brought another wave of retrospectives. NPR, Rolling Stone, Pitchfork, all ran features examining the album's place in rock history. The consensus: Strange Days was ahead of its time. The darkness, the experimentalism, the refusal to repeat a hit formula. These qualities that hurt it in 1967 were precisely what made it endure. By 2025, Strange Days sits comfortably in the canon of essential rock albums. Not the most popular Doors album, not their biggest seller, but possibly their most important. The one that showed they were artists, not just hitmakers. The one that proved they could follow success with ambition. The one that chose risk over safety. And every time a band releases a difficult second album, something more experimental than their debut, something that confuses fans but excites critics, They're walking the path Strange Days carved. They're betting on legacy over immediacy. They're choosing to be remembered over being rich. Sometimes, like the Doors, they get both. Just not at the same time. September 1967. A band at the height of their fame chooses the hardest path. They refuse to repeat themselves. They experiment with technology most people have never heard. They record in darkness because that's when truth emerges. They release an album they believe is their masterpiece and watch it become their worst-selling record. 58 years later, that album is considered one of rock's essential works. This is the story we keep telling ourselves about art. That quality eventually wins, that time reveals truth, that commercial disappointment doesn't equal failure. And with Strange Days, it's actually true. But here's what the happy ending obscures. The cost. Jim Morrison never saw Strange Days recognized as a masterpiece. He died in 1971, 4 years after its release, having spent those years watching it be overshadowed by both the debut and subsequent albums. He gave interviews trying to explain what they'd attempted, why Horse Latitudes mattered, why the backwards piano and Moog experiments were important. Few people listened. Producer Paul Rothchild, who believed Strange Days would be bigger than anything the Beatles had done, spent the rest of his life defending it. He never got to see it vindicated. He died in 1995, 18 years before Rolling Stone put it on their 500 greatest albums list. Engineer Bruce Botnick lived to see Strange Days finally receive its due. In interviews during the 40th and 50th anniversary editions, he talked about those sessions, the darkness, the candlelight, Morrison lying on the floor at 3 a.m., the band pushing 8-track technology to its limits. He was gratified, but also wistful. "We knew it was special," he said. "It just took everyone else a while to figure it out." The lesson of Strange Days isn't just about artistic integrity triumphing over commercial pressure. It's about the cruelty of timing, about how the best work isn't always recognized in the moment, about how artists make albums for the future without knowing if that future will ever arrive. The Doors took an enormous risk with Strange Days. They had every reason to play it safe, to give Elektra another Light My Fire, to repeat the formula that had made them famous. Instead, they went darker, weirder, more experimental. They used Moog synthesizers before most people knew what synthesizers were. They recorded poetry that made audiences uncomfortable. They made an album that asked listeners to work, to pay attention, to engage. And in 1967, most listeners said no thanks. They wanted Light My Fire Part 2. They wanted easy hits and sing-along choruses. They wanted the Doors to be what they'd already been, not what they were trying to become. But a small group of listeners, critics, musicians, serious fans, heard something else. They heard ambition. They heard a band refusing to repeat themselves. They heard the sound of artists actually using the studio as an instrument, creating textures and atmospheres that hadn't existed before. Those listeners kept Strange Days alive. They wrote about it, recommended it, defended it. They made it the album you discovered after you'd exhausted the debut. The album that separated casual fans from serious ones. The album that proved you really understood the Doors. And slowly, over decades, the reputation grew. From commercial disappointment to cult favorite to acknowledged masterpiece. From the album even die-hard fans skipped to the album critics called essential. From Paul Rothchild's Broken Dream to Stephen Davis's great artifact of the rock movement. Strange Days is proof that artistic ambition matters. That taking risks is worth it, even when those risks don't pay off immediately. That the best revenge on an industry demanding you repeat yourself is to create something so good that history eventually takes your side. But it's also proof that vindication doesn't heal all wounds. Morrison never knew. Rothchild never knew. They made a masterpiece, they believed in it, they defended it, and they died before the world agreed with them. Is that a happy ending? Or a tragedy? Or both? Maybe the answer is in the music itself. Pull up Strange Days. Put on headphones. Listen to that Moog processed vocal on the title track. Feel the eerie wrongness of that backwards piano on Unhappy Girl. Let yourself be unsettled by hoarse latitudes. Give yourself to the 11-minute journey of When the Music's Over, and ask yourself, is this a successful album or a failed one? The answer is yes. Both. Always. Strange Days failed in 1967. Strange Days succeeded forever. And somewhere in that contradiction lies everything that matters about making art. This has been the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. And some stories like this one take decades to tell themselves.